I was 26 years old when I got my first security job. It was to watch over a small stretch of woods and lake that had been in the process of being converted into a new campground, and for the most part, I loved it. I honestly only had one bad shift when I worked that job, and it was during one of the 2 times that I was called in to work overnight. We had gotten a report of people hanging out on the campgrounds, and my boss wanted us to make sure that they knew they were trespassing. The other few guys I worked with all figured that it was just a bunch of kids trying to blow off some steam, but still, it was my job to take care of it, so that's what I tried to do. I had to work 2 overnights in a row to catch the people who were sneaking onto the property because they didn't show up on that first night. But as soon as I arrived after sundown on the second night, I could smell something burning, which told me that someone was having a fire. I made sure to radio to my boss that I just arrived and that I was pretty sure that someone was on the premises before I began to make my way back into the dark woods. I turned my flashlight on because there wasn't much moonlight breaking through the clouds that night to help me see. With each step I took, I expected that I would start seeing the glow from a fire in the distance, but I was surprised as I kept smelling that burning smell but couldn't see any sign of flames. I continued to look around, but with each moment that passed, a voice in the back of my head began to tell me to turn back toward the gate that I was parked at. Man, I wish I listened to those feelings, but I didn't. The smell got stronger as I continued to walk deeper into the woods, and before I could see any sign of the fire causing it, I heard something that put me on my toes. I turned my flashlight off as I began hearing what I could swear was whispering. I listened for a moment before I heard the sound of someone quietly trying to shush someone else. I didn't hesitate to turn my flashlight in the direction of the noise and call out to them. "Hey, you guys are on private property. I'm gonna have to ask you to leave." I squinted my eyes as I tried to look for where the noises I heard were coming from, and that was when I saw them. Staring back at me from beyond a small bush was not 1, but 2 pairs of eyes. I tried to stay calm as I began telling them that they were trespassing again, but that was when I heard one of the people behind the bush say something to the other. "Grab him," he said in a gruff-sounding voice. I took a step back as I continued to watch from that direction, and to my horror, a dirt-covered man came rushing out from behind the bush. I turned around as quickly as I could and began running back toward the gate. I could hear the man screaming at the top of his lungs as he chased after me, and as soon as I was sure of my footing, I grabbed for my radio and called out for my boss as I continued to run. I yelled that I was being chased by someone on the property and told him to call the police. I continued to run as I looked back over my shoulder to see if I was still being chased. I couldn't hear the man anymore, so I started to slow down. That's when I saw it though. The dirt-covered man was still chasing me at full speed. I picked up my pace again and headed straight for the gate, and when I got there, I didn't waste any time getting into my car and then pulling away from the property. Once I was able to, I radioed my boss again, who told me that police were on the way. Once they arrived, I escorted them back into the woods in the direction that I was chased from. We didn't find anyone waiting for us, but we found what they were trying to hide. Hidden in a dugout hole that they had turned into a makeshift shelter, the officers found a small distillery that they said was probably being used to make moonshine. They tore the whole thing down, and after that, my boss had 3 guys working the overnight shift until the development was done. If there's one thing I'll never forget about that job, it was being chased by that deranged psycho. As the only security guard on staff who was a woman, I got used to getting strange looks from some of the older men at the hotel I worked at. But when it came down to it, I was the only one who wasn't afraid to do the more annoying or sometimes even scary tasks. My worst experience on the job came while I was working the overnight shift in the middle of the summer. I had just gotten into work at around 9:30 at night, and no more than 5 minutes in, I got a call on my radio that they needed some assistance in the laundry room, which was in the basement. They said that there was a supposedly disgruntled guest that refused to leave despite it being a restricted area. They undersold the disgruntled guest part though. As soon as I got the call, I began headed toward the elevator that would bring me down into the basement. I passed another guard on the way and asked if they wanted to help me out, but he said he was busy and to call on the radio if I needed anything. I rolled my eyes and got into the elevator that took me right where I needed to be. Now, I had never been afraid of going into the hotel basement before, especially not the laundry room, but this time was different. As soon as the elevator stopped, I started to hear what sounded like someone in danger. My eyes widened as the elevator doors opened and the screaming sound got louder. Each shriek was so loud that I couldn't help but wince at them. I slowly started to walk down the hallway toward the laundry room as a sense of unease began to course through every inch of my body. Each step I took made each scream that I heard louder and louder. And when I stepped through the doorway of the laundry room, I realized that the problem was a bit more serious than I realized. Standing in the corner of the room between the wall and one of the dryers, I could see the backside of a half-naked adult who was facing the corner and screaming every second or two. I took a minute to figure out how to best handle the situation before I pulled out my radio and called upstairs to let them know that I may need some help in the basement. By the time I was done talking on the radio, I hadn't noticed that the man had stopped screaming and was now facing me. He looked like he was in his 50s with thinning dark hair that was slicked back with sweat or grease. His eyes were bloodshot to the point where I could hardly see the whites in them. I froze as he stared at me. I didn't know what to do. It was like he was looking right through me. And before I could say anything to the man, he screamed again. The scream startled me and caused me to step back, which might have been what triggered the man to lunge at me. Maybe he didn't like that I made a sudden move, I'm not sure. All I could tell at that moment was that he was unstable and coming right for me. I tried to move out of the way, but he was too fast and quickly grabbed me by the shoulders and threw me to the ground. The man leaned over top me and screamed as loud as he could in my face, spitting all over me in the process. I was scared for my life, wondering if he was going to continue attacking me. But I don't think that was his intention. After screaming in my face, the man stood up straight and then darted out of the room and further into the basement. I called for backup and requested that they call the police. I was too afraid to make my way back to the elevator by myself, so I simply waited for the other security guards to meet me in the laundry room. But with each second that passed, I was worried that the screaming man would come back and attack me again. It took about 20 minutes for police to arrive and meet me in the basement, but they had no trouble finding the attacker because he was still periodically screaming as he ran throughout the basement. Once they arrested him, the officer said it seemed like he was most likely a guest who had been under the influence of something, so they ended up taking him to jail for the night at least. That was hands down my scariest night on the job, but I'm happy that I didn't suffer any serious injuries. If I can impart one piece of wisdom to anyone, it's to listen to your guts and those around you when they tell you something doesn't feel right. I was still a security guard for a local club in my city that had live music every weekend, and some of the performers were pretty big artists. And I'll never forget the night that I got called in to cover for another guard that worked at the club, Marcus. I didn't want to go in on my night off, but I needed the money, especially since the holidays were coming up, so I reluctantly accepted. But as I walked out of the door and said goodnight to my girlfriend at the time, she told me that she had a bad feeling and not to go to work. I wish I listened. I got to the club about an hour before the musicians arrived and started unpacking their gear, and I remember thinking that I needed to look up to see how famous they were because a line had already started forming outside. I went about my normal duties and walked around the floor and stage to make sure everything was safe and ready for the show. But as I was turning to get off the stage, I noticed someone staring at me from backstage. I made eye contact with them, which caused them to turn and start to walk the other way. This was a red flag to me, and I started following after them. But before I could get behind the stage, they had already disappeared into one of the rooms. I shook my head and then figured it was probably another stagehand or something, and just continued doing my work when one of the club directors came up to me and asked if I would clear the dressing rooms for the talent when they arrived. I told him yes sir and made my way into the back. The first dressing room I went to was already empty, so I made sure it was clean and ready to be used before checking out the next one. I walked up to the second dressing room and was surprised to see the door was already closed. Just in case the band had gotten there already, I decided to knock before walking in. I called up to see if anyone was inside, but there was no answer. I reached out and grabbed the door handle, but before opening the door, I'll never forget this strange feeling that came over me. Every bone in my body was telling me not to go through that door. But I just shook the feeling off and told myself that it was my job and that I had to do it. I turned the handle and stepped into the room. The first thing I noticed when I stepped in was that one of the clothing racks had been pulled out from the wall, but other than that, it seemed like everything was normal. I walked over to the rack and began pushing it back against the wall, but it wouldn't move. There was something blocking it. I walked around to the other side of the rack, and that was when I saw the same person that had been staring at me from backstage. They had tucked themselves behind the clothing rack and seemed to be waiting for the band to show up. When I noticed them, I went to yell, but before I could get anything out, I saw a flash of metal jolt toward me. I stepped back and out of the way as I noticed that the person in the dressing room was armed with a large knife that he was violently swinging my way. I took another step backward as the man behind the clothing rack stepped forward and continued to stab and sting his knife forward. My back ended up pressed against the wall. There was nowhere for me to go. I let out a gasp for air as I felt the man's blade stab into my stomach. He looked into my eyes as I clutched at my gut, and he pulled the knife out, causing me to drop down to the floor. I could feel my body being dragged toward the corner of the room as everything around me started to go black. I passed out for at least 10 minutes before I woke up to the sound of someone else knocking at the door. I remember feeling dazed as I opened my eyes and began remembering what had just happened to me. I looked up as I heard another knock on the door, and I let out a quick cry for help before realizing that the man who attacked me was still hiding in the dressing room waiting. I saw the door open, and I yelled for the guard on the other side to get help and that there was an assailant in the room with me. The security guard stepped back and radioed for the other guards to come to the dressing room. It took all 5 of them to apprehend the man and get the blade away from him, and thankfully by that point, an ambulance had been called as well. I wasn't able to speak with the police that night because I needed surgery, but afterward, they followed up with me at the hospital. Apparently, the man was waiting for a member of the band. He confessed that he planned to kill him because the man's wife cheated on him with one of the musicians. I just happened to be the security guard who got caught in the crossfire.